Hello and welcome back. This is Jennifer and I hope you're having a great week. So Distress Oxide inks are by far the most unique ink on the market. They are great for ink blending, stamping on dark paper, and much more. Well, today I'm going to show you how they are excellent for watercolor. Distress Oxide inks have those unique properties that allow the color to show up even if you watercolor on dark colored cardstocks. I'll have some tips and a couple examples for you, but I'm going to start out by first showing you the newest colors of Distress Oxide ink, since I'll be using some of those today. The 12 new colors of Distress Oxide ink include Spun Sugar, Barn Door, Ripe Persimmon, Mustard Seed, Crushed Olive, Mowed Lawn, which is my favorite, Stormy Sky, Tumbled Glass, another one I like, Dusty Concord, Old Paper, Tea Dye, and Ground Espresso. Now, Distress Oxide inks, as I mentioned, are very unique. They have some dye ink properties and some pigment ink properties. And because it has both, these inks can do things that other inks can't. Now, instead of going into all the things that these inks can do, I highly encourage you to click up here on the top right to watch my introduction video to Distress Oxide inks. That will provide lots of information and many different techniques that you might want to try. However, there are a few properties that are unique to these inks that I'm going to take advantage of in today's video. First, these inks react great with water, so they're good for watercolor. Second, they are slightly opaque, which means you can't really see through them as much. So we're going to be able to use these on dark colored cardstocks. And when they come in contact with water, they kind of turn a little bit white, like this oxide look. And it gives you a creamy or chalky effect. Here are what the colors look like with the ink just kind of spread out on some white cardstock. These are my ink swatches, and if you go over to my blog, I'll have a link below. You can download a file that allows you to create your own ink swatches like these. So again, these are the 12 new colors. Now, if you look closely, you can see kind of the chalky finish or the oxide look that you get with these inks. Really unique, and they'll look great when we watercolor them in today's video. When you add these 12 new colors with the older colors, there are now 48 colors of Distress Oxide ink. Here are my ink swatches for all of the Distress Oxide inks. I keep them in coin pocket protector pages, or whatever you want to call these, and I'll link to a video showing how I do that. So I'll just show you a close-up look of the colors slowly. You can take a screenshot if you want to get a comparison between colors, or I have photos of all of these over on my blog. So some of the new colors this time are the Spun Sugar, which is really great for today's technique. Barn Door, Ripe Persimmon. The Mustard Seed is a great vibrant yellow. We also have the Crushed Olive there on the bottom. Now on the other side, we have the Mowed Lawn, which is a great like Kelly green color, and the Tumbled Glass, which is the perfect sky color. The one not labeled there on the left is Salty Ocean. I'm not sure why it doesn't have a label on it. Stormy Sky is new. And then we have on the bottom here, that black one that's not labeled is Black Soot. So sorry, that one's not labeled too. Ground Espresso is new, and so is the Tea Dye there at the top. So there's a closer look at all the colors, and I'll be using many of these in today's video. I'll tell you, Tim Holtz has come out with some beautiful colors, and I'm really excited about using them all. Okay, so let's start with the Distress Oxide ink watercolor. On both of my cards, I'm using the Simon Says Stamp Beautiful Flower stamp set. These flower images are perfect for coloring, and there are lots of sentiments on here, and you can combine them to create a variety of sentiments. I'll be using my MISTI stamping tool. However, you could just use a large acrylic block if that's all you have. And I have a piece of 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch Lawn Fawn Blue Jay cardstock. It's a beautiful navy color. Now I used a creative corner to kind of hold my paper out a bit so that the stamp can kind of hang off the edge of my cardstock. I find those creative corners very handy to have if you have a MISTI stamping tool. So I'll put my magnet in place, close the door onto the stamp, and next I'll use my anti-static powder tool. This is very important because you don't want to have a messy heat embossed image. And then I'll stamp the image with VersaMark ink. This is just a clear sticky ink that will hold our embossing powder. After I've stamped this firmly, you want to put muscle into it since it's such a big image. I will go ahead and add some white embossing powder. I like the Hero Arts white embossing powder. I find that to give the best results, but there are lots of great white embossing powders out there. Now to paint with the Distress Oxide ink, I'm going to press the ink pad directly onto my work surface. I work on a Tim Holtz media mat. It is incredible. It's a glass surface, perfect for any kind of technique you want to do. I then spray some water into the ink, and you can see that right away it kind of gives an oxidized look. It gets white and very creamy. I'll then paint this into my flower. If you do not have a glass mat like this, you can also press your ink onto a plastic plate or an acrylic block and then add water. I can go and add more color to my brush. The more water I use, the less intense the color will be. The less water I use, the more intense my color will be. Now you'll notice because I'm using Distress Oxide ink, the color is showing up even on this dark cardstock. And I found that even though this isn't watercolor paper, it still works great. Notice I'm really not taking much effort to get perfect results. I'm just adding as much color as I can. Now if I were to use traditional distress inks for this, the non-oxide inks, the color wouldn't show up. Since those are a type of dye ink, the color is transparent and you wouldn't see it. But since these have a little bit of an opaque property to them, the color is showing up on dark cardstock. Now here I pressed Mowed Lawn onto my glass surface, added a little bit of water, and I'm painting in the leaves. And you can see how green shows up nicely on here too. Another nice thing about the Distress Oxide inks is once these dry, I can go and add more layer to it, more color, or try to make them a little more opaque. Whatever you want to do, the sky is the limit here. This time I have Blueprint Sketch. And this really looks gorgeous against the navy. It just almost makes the color glow a bit. Now you may notice as this dries that light blue flower that we started with ends up having kind of a chalky appearance to it, like a creamy chalky appearance that's very unique and I think is beautiful. It reminds me of old printed colored pages. Now for this flower I'm doing Shaded Lilac, and you can see how the light purple even shows up on the dark colored cardstock. Now at this point, I thought I would start and go adding more color onto the original flowers that have dried. You could add more color before they're dry, but I like to layer on top. I'm putting some more color on my work surface and watch as I spray it. It gets like a white look. This is tumbled glass and broken china. I found one spray of water is enough water to add to it, but you can use more water if you want to. Here I'm going back and adding more color to that original flower. I really just kind of move my brush around and kind of pounce it on the paper so that it leaves a good amount of color behind. And I'm also adding a little broken china to this just to give a variation in color. Now to the other two flowers, I added a little Dusty Concord Distress Oxide ink and Seedless Preserves. That's like a magenta color, a pinkish purple, and that color really makes these flowers pop. Onto the tips of the leaves, I added a little bit of Crushed Olive Distress Oxide ink. That has a little bit of a yellow to it, so it really makes those stand out also. Once this was all dry, I added my sentiment. Again, I'm using my MISTI and another one of the creative corners. This is going to help me to make sure that I get this long sentiment straight. So I push the stamp right up against that L-shaped creative corner. That way I know it's straight, and then I can close the door of my MISTI. I used my anti-static powder tool, stamped this with VersaMark ink, and I'll again add white embossing powder. Next, I'll stamp the word hello right above that. This hello is from a discontinued Simon Says stamp set, but any small little hello sentiment would work here. After I heat embossed these, I took my panel outside and I added a fixative to it. I don't like using sprays inside my house, so I do this outside. You really don't need to use a fixative, but I want to be sure that this is protected. Sometimes the oxides have a chalky feel to them, so I want to be sure that they stay put. After I've done this, I have a piece of white Kraft foam, and I'm using my Gina Connect glue to add this to the back of our painted panel. This will give it nice, even raised dimension in the mail. Next, I'll put the Gina Connect glue on the other side and glue this onto a 4¼ by 5½ inch white note card. I did trim the blue piece down a little bit, by the way. By using the liquid adhesive, I can kind of move it around until it's positioned perfectly. I also stamped a matching envelope with the same image. So here is a closer look at the painting. You can kind of see the chalky or creamy finish that it has. It's just gorgeous. And how bright those colors turned out, even though we watercolored on a dark colored cardstock. Okay, so my next example uses the same stamp set. However, this time I'm doing the painting on Kraft cardstock. There's something really beautiful about the vibrancy of the Distress Oxide inks on Kraft. I'm again using a creative corner to hold my paper in the center of my MISTI so that I can allow this large stamp to hang off the edge. This time I'm using black VersaFine ink. Whenever I want a black heat embossed image, I like to use a black pigment ink with clear embossing powder. I find that black embossing powder can sometimes be messy, and this gives beautiful results. So after I've heat set that side, I'm going to put this back in my MISTI in the same position but rotated 180 degrees, and I'll stamp it again. This will give us the same image on the top and the bottom and allow room in the center for our sentiment. Again, I'll stamp it, add the clear embossing powder, and heat set it. As always, be sure to use an anti-static powder tool before you stamp to make sure that you get nice, crisp heat embossed results. I can't recommend any kind of anti-static powder tool enough. Okay, so now it's time to add the sentiment. Again, I'm using one of the MISTI creative corners to help me make sure that I get this centered and straight. Those creative corners are very useful if you have a stamping tool. Close the door of my MISTI. Again, I will stamp this with the black VersaFine ink and clear heat emboss. Then I will add the words "You Are" from the same stamp set right above it. This time I'm starting with two new colors. We have Barn Door and Ripe Persimmon. You can see how bright those are. I'll press them on my work surface and add a little water and start painting. Now you could also use your Distress Oxide re-inkers for watercolor. Just put a small drop onto a palette, add a little water, and you can watercolor away. In fact, you can get even more intense results using the re-inker, but I thought in today's video I would just use the pads themselves. Now, I am not one to buy re-inkers often. I almost never buy re-inkers. However, there are two inks that I recommend having re-inkers for. That's the traditional Distress inks and these Distress Oxide inks. The reason I recommend having the re-inkers is that you use them for a lot of techniques, so you want to re-ink the pad often. Also, it's just the way they are designed, but the good news is there are many techniques in which the re-inkers are fun to use, such as for watercolor. Okay, this time I'm using Squeezed Lemonade and Mustard Seed, and together you can see how those colors glow on that Kraft cardstock. It's just beautiful. A lot of the lighter colors, such as this is Spun Sugar, a light pink, really are bright against the Kraft colored cardstock. Onto the Spun Sugar, I'm adding a little bit of picked raspberry just to add a little bit of a darker pink to it. Now you may notice that some of the color is sitting on top of the black embossing. What I do is I allow everything to dry, then I just lightly dab a baby wipe onto the embossing. You don't want to rub too much or you'll mess up the Distress Oxide coloring. You just want enough to remove that color from the embossed surface. It should come off very easily. Then again, I'll take this outside and spray it with a fixative. Now this time I decided to color in the word beautiful with white, so I used a white Jelly Roll pen for this. You could use a Distress Oxide ink color to fill this in if you want to, but I decided to go for a bright white. I trimmed the panel down a little bit, added Kraft foam behind it, and glued it onto a white 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch note card. I also used the same stamp to create a matching envelope. Here you can see that beautiful look that you get with the Distress Oxide inks painted onto the Kraft cardstock. I feel like these inks work great on all colors of cardstock, but there's something magical about them on Kraft. All right, so there you go, a look at the new Distress Oxide ink colors and how you can use them for watercolor. I will link here to some other Oxide ink videos, including one Tim did where he shows the newest Oxide inks. Thank you so much for watching. If you are interested in the supplies, they're linked below. Have a great day, and we'll see you again soon.